Today we'll be hearing from Stacy Stallings, retired master police officer from the Longmont Police Department in Colorado. She served as a school resource officer at Silver Creek High School for 8 years. There, she developed a student restorative justice team and implemented restorative justice at Silver Creek High School. She also provided training for campus supervisors and the school district on restorative conversations. Let's hear about her experience.
Stacy, thank you so much for joining me today and having this conversation about SROs and the work that you're doing in our communities. So just to start off, would you be able to share your name, your role, and how you've used restorative practices?
Yes, I am Staceys Stallings. I'm a retired master police officer now, as of a couple of months ago. And I worked with Longmont Police Department in Longmont, Colorado. And I was the school resource officer at Silver Creek High School in Longmont. I kind of introduced restorative justice at Silver Creek, and in the process learned more about restorative practices beyond restorative justice. And I was aware of a pilot program that we actually had in Longmont prior to me becoming an SRO at a different high school, at Longmont High School. And that was a 5-year program. So I really can't take hardly any credit, because I looked at that model and that pilot program and thought, that's what I want to do. If I want this, I'm going to have to do it. I'm going to have to be that person because I'm stationed here. This is my beat. This is my little city within a city. And I say that teenage years are like dog years. When something is happening in their lives, it's their whole life. If something happens to them at school, or there's a social issue, or they're victimized, or if they have committed some kind of wrongdoing or committed a crime, it's their whole world. And if we don't resolve that in some way, fairly quickly, it gets brushed under the rug for the next thing. But it's still underlying. We all know that nothing ever really gets blown off. You know, the harm is still there. They just kind of move on, but it hasn't really resolved inside of them. And so that's why I wanted an in-house model for restorative justice, is so that we could handle. My goal from the beginning was to handle an incident from the time of incident to the time of conference for a restorative justice piece was within 1 to 2 weeks. I would always like to have completed the pre-conference portion within that first week.
That's wonderful, Stacy. I really appreciated your conversation about the timing of the conference and how important that is because of how teenagers are going through their life kind of day by day, and nothing is brushed under the rug. And so my question for you is, with timing being so important and the teenage years being really essential in their development, how has introducing restorative justice impacted these students' development?
So the biggest thing that I think is missing, I have seen it, in my opinion, decline over the years, is simply taking responsibility for our actions. To me, it's honorable to take responsibility. Somehow we've lost sight of that. So restorative practices and restorative justice teaches them how to take responsibility. So teaching them how to do that and what outcomes are possible when they do that is so important. So that's one of the primary, I think, skills that we can teach them. They can also learn how to be vulnerable, and that it's okay to do that. That to me is another big part. Problem solving, especially with a student team involved. They get to sit in this circle and there's a problem and we're going to solve it together. this adult over here isn't going to solve it for me. My mom is not even here, so she's not going to solve it for me. That teacher's not going to. They're not here. We're going to solve that as our own community and our. So that kind of is a segue into teaching them how to hold one another accountable as peers, as equals, so that there's no power differential. And communication, healthy and effective communication. And so being able to have a conversation that's productive and healthy, even if it's intense and emotional, can be done.
Yeah, all of that learning is essential, especially, I mean, essential for us even. I feel like I could benefit from continually learning and seeing these practices be in place. And you mentioned the student team. I'd love to hear more about what the student team is, what their role is, and how it began.
I'll be honest, it was one of the more challenging things. How do I get kids to get involved in this? I'm the police officer in the school. It's not always, there's some kids that don't mind and they maybe even want to be police officers. So it's cool to interact with the cop. Oh my gosh, I got to talk to Officer Stallings today. Oh, I learned this, I learned that. But a lot of times though, it's not cool to talk to the cop. Are they snitching? What are they doing? I mean, our kids that we knew were very law enforcement supportive, that would jump into it. But our other kids that maybe they didn't have the best behavior, maybe they had already had negative experiences with police officers. I want those kids involved too. Well, I started off by reaching out to teachers and asking if they would allow me to have a little time, whether it's 15 minutes or a whole block, to talk to the kids about restorative justice, just so that they could get familiar with the term, and then throw out the invite. If you're interested in participating in this with me, please contact me. Let's talk. Let's see if this is something that you think you would benefit from and enjoy. We have a 4-year program at our high school, and I realize not every school is going to have something like this, but it could be the basketball team, or it could be choir, because I think all of these groups that we have in every school have some component of leadership. And when I was talking to the leadership director, she said, Stacy, this is like in perfect alignment with the values of leadership. It's community service oriented. It's being involved and inclusive. It's, stepping up to do more in your community. And so I'm like, great. How can we kind of put these things together? How can we work together? And so there are some kids that are ambassadors in the leadership program. And she's like, I am giving you my ambassador team. That's your team. Every year since then, I've had a student that has volunteered to take restorative justice as their capstone. And then how that's beneficial is now they're recruiting, and it's part of their job kind of in the leadership academy to recruit underclassmen. And then the idea is we have peers from all the grades involved in the team, and that they have then progressive training and knowledge about restorative practices as they continue through their high school career, and ultimately will take it as their capstone as well. You kind of just have to find a group or a club that might align with some of the values of restorative justice. It might be like a government class or something like that, that they can take on that stuff. And so the team themselves, we would meet regularly. We would try to meet twice a month. Sometimes when things got really busy for students, like for all their extracurriculars and things, not all of them can make it all the time, which is fine. And during those meetings, we would always go over some training on like active listening skills and empathy and having respectful and restorative conversation, like a different style, using I statements, things like that. So we would have a little training and we would have some team building and then probably some pizza. And and that was, again, just another opportunity for me to build relationships and trust with these kids. And so that's kind of what we would do in between. So really the part of the team's, I guess, biggest active role is they are the community members in the conferences. So they speak on, they're the voice of the school community when we have a conference. And so if a student was referred to me, there was an incident and they took responsibility and the harmed party said, yeah, I want to participate, then we would have a restorative justice conference and I would reach out to a student team member or two, ideally, to participate in that and help to build the contract, to brainstorm, repair items and build a contract.
That is awesome. That is so awesome to have these students be able to participate, be able to learn all of these important skills and take on this leadership, both in their communities and their schools. And so I'm assuming that folks listening to this are probably like, okay, that sounds wonderful. I want that. How do I get it into my school? So for other SROs, what advice would you give them for implementing, if they're considering implementing restorative practices?
The first step, I think, would be to meet with an administrator. I think that most SROs, if they didn't know going in, learned pretty quickly. We were kind of used to the city. Most of us come from patrol. We're kind of used to the city being our house. We take ownership in it. This is our house. We're here to protect it. And we feel that way, but we don't run that household. The administrators run the household. And so keeping them in good graces and pitching this idea to them. First of all, it should be pretty easy because this is probably the best way to avoid the school to prison pipeline. But secondly, if they're willing to work with you, then they can even reduce suspension or eliminate suspension in lieu of restorative justice. So that should increase attendance. And having them sitting in seats in classrooms is going to directly relate to their success. So that kind of segues into my next advice is you can't wing it. I tried it. And I was so confused I'm like, why didn't my conference look like the community conferences I go to? Well, I wasn't pre-conferencing. I wasn't getting the story and preparing the kids for the conference. I didn't even really have enough foundational training myself. Like I was telling you, I was just restorative justice. That was my piece in the past. And so I needed more training, like the facilitator training and the conflict resolution training. And so seek some of that out. I think there's probably a lot of communities now that are offering that kind of thing, even if it's just mediation training, things that are more youth specific or just more appropriate school skill specific training. So they should be able to find something like that is what I'm trying to get at. And so that they can, because they're going to be the ones that are leading this. And if they don't really understand it themselves, it probably won't be successful. And you're going to end up kind of irritated with restorative justice and thinking, no, it doesn't work. I've seen that with my fellow SROs, because everybody loves it because we sit, casually in conferences and all of the other work has been done and it looks easy. And really there's a lot of steps involved before we get to that stage. And if you skip them, it's not as effective. So it could potentially feel like a waste of time. So that would be my other piece of advice. As I mentioned earlier, it would be to be patient. It took me a while to understand that. And now I do, and now I really recognize the importance of doing that. And so that would be my other piece of advice is it's a marathon, not a sprint. Just accept it from the beginning, because you won't give up on it, because I almost gave up on it numerous times throughout this process. And so just learning to let culture change happen by introducing some of the other restorative practices in the school in cooperation with, this is another example of a piece of implementation, was the administrator that wanted to be involved also created a lot of the professional development on our late start days for staff and asked me to come in and teach them restorative conversations and connection circles. And so then they could start doing that legwork in the classrooms, because I wasn't always in the classroom. I was rarely in the classroom unless I had been invited to teach a class. They're in there with them every day, so they can start implementing some of these practices to develop this culture change. Oh, one other thing about that is don't be intimidated by it, because when I was initially introduced, or if you go online and Google how to implement restorative justice, I'm pretty sure it was a school district in Oakland that has a PDF manual online available. There's a lot of them, but I was like, oh, that I know they're like the leaders in this. And I pulled it up and it's like, I don't know, 200 pages. It's long, and it talks about multi-tier systems of support and all of this stuff that as a police officer, that's not my language. That's Greek. And I'm like, I don't know that. I don't know what MTSS even is. It doesn't apply to me, so I kind of got frustrated by that. And I'm like, okay, this is out of my league. Now I understand why the pilot program had a full-time in-house staff member doing this. But I learned that I can still do it without knowing that language and without having a master's degree in education or without having some kind of formal training in program development. It's just, like I said, I just had to be really patient. So that's what I would recommend. And also reaching out to other people who have done it, like myself.
I love that you said that, because even though maybe there isn't that specific manual for the work that you're doing, this video and you as a resource and the work that you've done really serves as that manual for folks who are starting these processes and implementing these in their schools. So thank you so much for being in this space with me and sharing some of the wonderful work that you're doing. I am so excited to hear about how your work continues and how your students are continually impacted, and how they impact their own communities. It's amazing. So thank you so much, Stacey, for being in this space with me today.
Thank you for having me.